Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Summers and I'm the CEO at Insync. We work closely with our clients to help them improve their business, often by measuring things with them and helping them to improve an experience, whether it's an employee engagement experience, a customer experience, a patient experience, or many other things. We've been really fascinated recently at the conversations that are happening about psychosocial hazards in the workplace. We know that this is something that's on many of our clients' minds, and we're having lots of conversations about that and building some really interesting data points along the way. I'm really delighted to have three guests join me today. I'd like to introduce them to you, and we're going to have a conversation about psychosocial hazards in the workplace and hopefully unpack and demystify some of the things that are going on. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erika Szerda. She's a principal at Insync. She's also a psychologist and a behaviourist. Hi, Erika.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Next up, we have Michelle Maugueret, co-founder of the Growth Collective. She's got significant experience of leadership and HR, and she was recently the CPO at Bank First. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And finally, Steve Macchi. So Steve is a lawyer, and he's also director of the workplace consultancy Insight Workplace Solutions. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
We're going to get straight into a couple of questions and we'll have a bit of a chat and see how that goes. And the first thing that I'm really interested in are kind of what are psychosocial hazards and do they matter? Erika, can you maybe briefly explain what psychosocial hazards are?
Absolutely. So I'm going to be using the ComCare definition initially. And psychosocial hazards are aspects of work which have the potential to cause psychological or physical harm. So they're typically ongoing stressors that we do experience in the workplace. And when we are looking at psychosocial hazards, it's really about looking at the interactions. So it's not just the one element, i.e. we might have a lack of role clarity or what have you. It's really about the interaction of these issues. Are they ongoing and are they likely to then cause either psychological or physical harm to our employees? Really important to note that stress is not classified as a psychosocial hazard per se, but there's various aspects which, if interacting, they can, such as workloads, lack of job clarity, poor manager or colleague support, inadequate change management, organisational culture and or interpersonal relationships, all of which, if they do conspire in a particular way, may cause harm to an employee.
Thank you, Erika. Excellent. And we understand that employers are liable if someone physically hurts themselves in the workplace, depending on certain things. Steve, what's the legal position at the moment when it comes to psychosocial hazards in the workplace?
Yeah, I think, certainly we've always had a pretty strong position, I think, in Australia about safety at work and the importance of employers providing a safe workplace. And perhaps what's shifting a little bit at the moment is that sense that safety doesn't just mean physical safety, it's also psychological safety. And we're seeing the relevant authorities in different states start to talk more about, look, we're going to look hard at psychological safety in different workplaces. And we're also, again, I don't want to make this a political discussion, but I think given the fact that we now have Labor governments in at federal and state level largely throughout the country, that we're now seeing a focus, as you'd expect, given Labor's background, on workplace issues, including workplace safety, including psychological and psychosocial issues. So we're seeing, I think, that move from a more generic look, obviously everyone needs to be safe at work, to more specific requirements on employers to say, look, in order to satisfy your obligations, you're going to need to demonstrate that you've done these kinds of things to address physical issues and also psychosocial issues in the workplace.
And are you seeing that being reflected in your workloads? You do lots of investigatory work. Are you seeing that change?
There's definitely been a shift, I think, over time in terms of what the issues are that are arising in the workplace and the issues that, whether it's employees individually or collectively are raising, are issues about how they're being treated. And I think Erika mentioned a couple about workloads, about role clarity, and about the behaviour of their colleagues, and the impact it's having on them psychologically. but also the impact. I think we're seeing more people say, look, I'm having a physical effect as well. So my lack of workplace clarity has affected me psychologically, and also I've been to my doctor, and my doctor's reporting that my blood pressure is elevated, my risk of heart attack is now elevated because of these risks. So I think it's important to understand that we're talking about psychosocial issues, but they have both a mental health impact and they can also have a physical health impact. And I think we're seeing those two things being linked more often now to these events are happening in the workplace, and it's not okay.
Yeah. And I think the vast majority of us know somebody, or even ourselves have experienced psychological challenges in the workplace and how they can manifest into physical issues. Yeah,
and I think I think we all accept work can be stressful. That's fine. No one's suggesting that work has to be entirely stress-free, and it would seem impossible for it to be that way. But it's about taking steps to try to minimise it and not make the effect unreasonable. I think it's really what it's about.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And Michelle, obviously you work a lot with leaders. Why should they be paying attention?
Leaders are right at the front of this. And there's some research that's come out recently that suggests that for 70% of people, your leader has a bigger impact on your mental health than your doctor or your therapist can, and equal to that of your partner. And so what that's going to mean for leaders is that they're going to need to be more engaged in conversation with their people and be more mindful of, what is impacting their people today and engaging in two-way flow of conversation. And I'm not saying here that they need to be accountable for their people's mental health, but what they do need to be is a lot more aware of what's going on in the workplace and have conversations and be able to spot and refer, but also have conversations about things like workload. Steve mentioned that, a workplace doesn't need to be completely stress-free, because stress can actually add an element of great productivity, but there is a balance to be struck, and they're the conversations that leaders need to be skilled at having.
Okay, so we're getting a bit of a feel for what psychosocial hazards are and why they matter and what role leaders should play in the workplace. Can we talk a little bit now about the impact of getting it wrong, I suppose? So Steve, if I can start with you, what could the legal implications be for your business for not creating a workplace environment that is safe from a psychosocial hazards perspective?
I think there's sort of a couple of elements to this. The first one is you're going to see more claims. I think it's clear that people have a better appreciation that, look, if my workplace is, if I'm unreasonably stressed at work, I've got a right to make a complaint about that or to make a claim about it. The second one is that I think we're seeing regulators now start to say, look, if we're seeing an abundance of claims from a particular workplace or from a particular industry, we're going to look more closely at that, and we're going to investigate psychosocial issues in the same way that we investigate other workplace safety issues. And the other one that I think is really significant, that I think we're seeing people start to appreciate, but maybe not quite appreciate, is I think we're seeing directors really appreciate that, look, it's my responsibility as a director. It's a personal responsibility, put aside the company's position. It's my responsibility as a director to make sure that people are safe in my company. And I need to be satisfying myself that we're doing all we reasonably can to make it safe from a psychosocial perspective. So I think you're seeing, certainly from my discussions with directors, I'm now at an age where I've seen an interesting evolution in what happens in directors' meetings. Certainly when I feel I started out, the directors heard principally from their chief operating officer and their chief financial officer. As time's gone on, people have been worried about different things and they've started to hear from other parts of their business. But I think what we're seeing now is a much more prominent role. Certainly I'm hearing from directors is they're very interested in hearing from their chief people officer about, how do our people feel in the workplace? Do they feel safe and supported and so forth? And I think that's because directors are appreciating that, look, they're responsible for safety. It's ultimately their responsibility, and they will be held to account personally if it doesn't happen. So that's the big shift I think we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Steve. And we're seeing quite a lot of high-profile cases coming out. So do you think we're entering a new era of accountability?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think we've seen that, from the perspective of what's being now discussed as wage theft, whereas I think 5 years ago people would have said, oh, look, it's an administrative error if you haven't paid people properly. Now people are saying, look, as a director, you've stolen from people if you haven't paid them properly. And similarly, I think with this, people have gone from saying, oh, people are a bit stressed, that's, these things happen at work, to saying, no, wait, that's a really important safety issue. We'd take it very, very seriously if, whenever we see, we've seen it recently internationally, but I think whenever we see, miners, we recognise an incredibly physically dangerous job, and directors of mining companies have been very conscious for a long time of the importance of making sure that the workers that go down the mine come back up at the end of the day and they're okay. And that's been fantastic, because it wasn't always the case, obviously. And I think we're seeing more now that people recognise, that people are talking about saying, well, making sure people go home from work physically okay is, psychologically okay is just as important as making sure they go home physically okay. And as a director, you're just as responsible for their psychological safety as you are for their physical safety.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And Michelle, it's not all bad, right? Because if you get this stuff right, I'm sure you as an ex-CPO can attest that there are some real benefits. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if the human case isn't compelling enough, the business case for getting this right absolutely is. Burnout and workplace stresses is accounting for, it's one of the biggest impactors impacting turnover today. And when it comes to holding on to talent, we've just come out of war on talent. We know it's so hard to retain your great people. When you aren't getting this right, you've got implications for employee productivity, you've got implications for workplace culture, you've got implications for the overall wellness of your employees. So when you do get this right, you have a workplace where people are humming along. We know that psychologically safe workplaces have a reduced risk of psychosocial hazards, but also psychological safe workplaces are known to have the best outcomes, not just from a working together and productivity perspective, but also from an innovation perspective and an effectiveness perspective. And those things are all great for the bottom line.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then unfortunately, Erika, we do see some organisations who are getting this wrong, and we see that there's an impact on their employees. So aside of the legal and reputational risks, what impacts have we seen on the engagement of employees when we don't get this right?
Well, we are seeing a very, very strong correlation between experiences of negative types of aspects at work, be it, high levels of workload, lack of role clarity, or, workplace work-related behaviours on engagement. So we're seeing if these things are occurring and we are reporting negative behaviours, we are more than likely to be disengaged. And then we also see the opposite. So if we're not experiencing these aspects at work, we are likely to be highly engaged. And when Michelle spoke of earlier around the leadership responsibility, that's absolutely the case. But what we're also seeing is that people leaders are at a real point in time where they are experiencing a whole lot of pressure and responsibility. So we're having to look quite closely at their engagement levels, because it's a little bit about, put the oxygen on yourself before you can help others. And what we are also seeing is that they tend to be more at risk with regards to these psychosocial hazards. So we are looking at both of these elements. And the funny thing about this is that, yes, our leaders have the responsibility to create conditions where we have high engagement and conditions of really positive psychosocial health. But as employees, we also have responsibilities, and it's a two-way street. And that's where I think education needs to occur, because it's not just the leader responsibility. I, as an employee, are equally responsible for this.
Thank you, Erika. And I think that's a good segue into what I'd like to talk about next, which is, well, okay, what can be done? And I don't think this needs to be a huge problem if people can attack it in the right way. So I might stay with you there, Erika. What advice would you give to organisations who are grappling with the best approach to creating a culture of psychological safety?
Look, for me, curiosity is one of the best leaders in. If we can create a culture whereby we are curious by nature, that opens us up to a whole host of different behaviors. We are not going up that assumptions ladder and, thinking that we understand things when we don't. It opens us up to innovation, to trialing different things. I'm also a big believer that we need to demonstrate care with performance, and care is all the things about I need to care about you as a person, but it also looks like I need to provide you with feedback as and when required, because they're both behaviors that demonstrate care, and they end up being driving performance in the right way. Post-COVID, we started to see that levels of emotional professionalism waned, and we were seeing quite interesting, and I'd love Steve's thoughts on this, behaviours at work where we regressed a little bit. So it's really about educating what is emotional professionalism at work, what is okay and what is not okay, and what does bringing oneself to work actually look like, because there is a degree of professionalism that we do need to adhere to. And as I mentioned earlier, I honestly believe that we need to support our people leaders more than we ever have before. Hybrid, post-COVID, emotional professionalism, all these types of things have put a whole lot more emphasis and a degree of stress on people. So I think the focus needs to be on supporting them a whole lot.
Thank you, Erika. Steve, did you want to jump in there?
Well, it's an interesting question. Have we seen more of these issues arise post-COVID? I think there's been an interesting issue in terms of the increase in remote working. And this is, I don't have data to back me up on this, but I mean, the position really is we're all imperfect. And certainly in my interactions, and I deal with a lot of allegations of workplace bullying and misconduct and so forth. And almost universally, I've never had someone make an allegation that didn't genuinely believe they'd been treated unfairly. And almost universally, I can say that the person who's alleged to have bullied them didn't intend to do anything mean or nasty. They didn't mean to upset the other person. Most people are going to work trying to do their best and genuinely doing the best they can, bearing in mind that, everyone's going to work with other pressures, whether it's I'm worried about interest rates rising and I can't pay my mortgage. I've recently had an illness in the family. All these things are really significant stresses, and everyone's doing their best is my general view of what people are trying to do at work. And perhaps there was a greater sense of when we're all working in the same office, we knew a bit more about the fact that, look, Steve's having a tough time at the moment. His kid's unwell. He's not at his best. You've got to cut him a bit of slack. And maybe when we're all a bit more removed from each other at home, we don't have that sense that, look, we've got to give an allowance to everyone for what else is going on in their lives. I think that there has been a bit of that post-COVID, that we're perhaps not as tolerant of each other's imperfections. I sort of sense that, but I don't have data to back that up. But certainly that's my sense. And I do feel there's a lot to be done in workplace about saying, look, generally everyone's coming here with good intent, and we really need to start the discussion by assuming good intent when we interact with other people at work.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, Steve. I think it also reminds me of why it's so important to ask a question and properly listen. And there's a few different ways you can do that. And of course, we love to help our clients to do that, to actively ask and to listen and measure and then drive through insights and improvement as a result. But that's not the only way. So, Michelle, I'm wondering, you work with a lot of emerging leaders. Do you think they've got the right capability in terms of maybe noticing if maybe there's something wrong with one of their people? Is there a capability gap there? Or actually is this new generation of leaders coming through a bit more in tune with how their people are feeling?
It's such an interesting question, because I think what I'm seeing with emerging leaders is the same as what I've seen with leaders of the past. Some people come with an innate sense of emotional intelligence that enables them to do this, and some people don't, and they actually need to learn it. At the Growth Collective, we have a framework for the fundamentals of leadership, and they've never been more important. And that starts with a bit of self-awareness. And the build on that is that then you need to be able to set context, hold people to account, give them feedback, and develop them to close those gaps. So if our leaders are building those capabilities as a foundation, and I call them a foundation, knowing full well that very experienced leaders are still not flexing their muscles around that and still need to build that capability. Because, Erika mentioned it before, our leaders are at risk. And if they can't demonstrate the self-awareness to know what's going on for them, they can't then take the next step and be aware of the impact they're then having on others. And that's a big key to getting this right. And if they then can't have the conversation that helps set expectations and give feedback in the moment, and that's a two-way flow with what Steve mentioned around clarity intent, we're going to continue to face into real challenges. So I really feel like leader capability is becoming so critical in getting this right. And I think leaders coming up today, if we invest now in them, they're more likely to get ahead. But I'm not necessarily seeing a really big gap in leaders of tomorrow versus the leaders of the past. It is something that some people come with and can build on it, or they have to work really hard at building that capability. But it can be built.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I'm sorry, if I may, just further to that. So what we're seeing, and there's actually data points on this, organizations tend to invest in their leaders once they're senior. The rub is that your behaviors are ingrained at that point. So you're better off investing when they're emerging so they can develop and flex the muscles necessary. But we always intervene too late. And this is where I think we need to start thinking differently. Do you agree, Michelle?
Absolutely. It's when in all the work that I do, I tend to get a lot of leaders, the request for leadership development is always for the sexier stuff. Let's talk adaptive. Let's talk about this for our senior leaders. And then I work with them and I'm like, oh, there's some real foundations missing. And all the coaching that I do with executives, we are leaning into the concept of self-awareness, their hang-ups about giving feedback. A lot of leaders, even now, more now than ever, they're feeling a lot of fear about leaning into their role of leadership out of fear for getting it wrong. And I think these changes are actually adding to that when they're not feeling like they've got the capability to equip it. And then when I get companies come to me about training, the foundations they want to reserve for their emerging leaders. And I say, let's get these foundations right for the senior leaders, because to Erika's point, sometimes those behaviours become quite ingrained, and it takes a lot of coaching and work with an individual to help them actually change that behaviour set that they've built up over many years.
Thank you. So it sounds to me that we are saying that if we get the right OHS frameworks right, and that they consider psychosocial hazards in the workplace, that if we measure what our employees are thinking and feeling, if we have leaders with the right capability to also observe where there may be challenges, to push into problems, to ask questions, then hopefully we don't have too much to worry about. But of course, we always understand that life's different. So there will be issues that come up. So Steve, I'm wondering from your perspective, if there's a leadership team out there or even a senior leader who's concerned, maybe they're receiving feedback or maybe they've just got other concerns, what should they do?
Well, I think you've got to be, the change we're really saying is you have to be proactive, not reactive. And I think it comes down, I mean, Erika mentioned before, curiosity is a great word, I think. If you're hearing things or if you're not hearing anything, you need to try to understand what is happening, how are people feeling. If they're not feeling great, why is that? What can you do about it? And it can be very simple stuff. So an example my colleague Bridget often gives is an example that happened in the medical field. And they were talking about the fact that people in an operating theatre feel very intimidated. They won't articulate it, but they feel very intimidated by the surgeons in the theatre. And they say quite often when a mistake happens, someone else in the theatre realised that something was going wrong but didn't speak up because they said, well, the surgeon's in charge of the surgery, I don't want to speak up. And they, she gives the example, they instituted at one place a policy of before the operation starts, you spend 2 minutes going through saying, who's everyone everyone in the theatre explains who they are, what their name is, and what their role is. And they said just simply acknowledging that people were there and had a role there made people much more prepared to say, look, this is going wrong. And often people will, realise that something's going wrong before the surgeon does, because the surgeon's focused elsewhere when the problem first emerges. And obviously the first time you raise it, the sooner you raise the issue, the more likely it is it can be addressed. And Bridget's example is, look, there are tremendous results from this very simple process. So I guess part of the message from my perspective is some of this stuff I think is really difficult and nuanced and so forth. But some of the strategies you can use if you're concerned are actually quite simple things, can be quite powerful, I think is what that stands for. I've got a question I'd love to ask, and it's about Ange Postecoglou, because I've been very interested in his approach this year. So Ange Postecoglou is an Australian coach who's recently become the coach of one of the large English clubs at Tottenham, and he's spoken a lot about how he interacts with players. And he's interesting because he's been quite specific about the fact that he doesn't form a close bond with players on a personal level. And he says, look, my role is to be clear about what the expectation is for players and to give them clear feedback about when they do and don't meet those expectations, and to set really high standards and hold players to account for those standards. But if they've got sort of issues in their personal life, I'm not equipped to discuss those issues. And we've got people at the club who do that, who are professional psychologists. So I ask the player to speak to the psychologist. I don't have those discussions. So it's been quite an interesting hearing him say that, because I think it sort of is against the trend we've seen of coaches really becoming close to players. I'm interested if people have got a view about that generally and how it applies in the workplace, and whether maybe we're expecting too much of managers to be confidants of their staff as well as managers.
Fascinating question, Steve. Thank you. I'm going to hand that over to some experts. I'm a self-declared huge Spurs fan, so I'm really interested in people's views on this. But it's a fascinating point, and I guess with an organisation the size of Tottenham Hotspurs, there's an enormous amount of support wrapped around a people leader. Not necessarily so in other working environments. Michelle, do you mind if I throw that one over to you?
No, happy to take this one because I've got a view on it. Look, I agree. I don't think you need to develop a personal relationship with someone to demonstrate care. And it sounds like he's doing just that in his leadership style and approach. He's being clear. He's giving them the feedback they need. He's holding them to account. They're not going to be second guessing where they need to be. But the most important thing that he's doing there is he's leveraging the resources that are relevant to support them where they can. It's actually, I genuinely believe it is not a leader's job to be an individual's counsellor. They're not equipped with it. They're not skilled at it. But if you're a leader, you need to know what the support resources are, and you need to make sure that your people know how to access them. So I wholeheartedly agree with that style of leadership. Some leaders do like to develop a close relationship, and I think if that's their style of leadership, that's great. But I don't think it's necessary to be a great leader. I think what makes a great leader is all those things that Steve just articulated around. He's very clear about what they need to accomplish. He lets them know the intent. He holds them to account. He gives them the great feedback, and he keeps them moving forward. And then he gets them access to the resources they need when they need it. And that is a demonstration of good leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Erika?
I completely concur with Michelle. Care does not equal I need to be your friend. Care can be many, many different things in the workplace. For me, care is about you as a leader can demonstrate an affinity. You can relate to the person that reports into you. But care at work really looks like I support you when you need support. I provide you with feedback. I connect you with all the growth and development opportunities there are. And if there is something that I am not equipped to do, I will link you to that. To me, that's what defines care in a workplace. It doesn't mean that we go out for drinks. If you do that, that's great, but that does not necessarily mean that that's care in the workplace. So I completely agree.
So staying on the subject of Spurs, which I love to stay on, Steve, you and I were chatting earlier on just before the interview about the game this morning, and Ange Postecoglou as a people leader, as a coach, and his position that if the players do what he asks them to do and they lose, then he is fully accountable for that, not them. And if they don't, then that's kind of on them. So it's an interesting style of leadership. Seems to be working in patches at Spurs. Maybe that's just the start. For me, that's about having clear accountabilities, and I'll often use a framework, a RACI framework, for example, or IAP2 framework, to make sure that when I'm communicating with my people, I'm very clear about what am I accountable for, what are they responsible for, and exactly who has what roles. So, Stephen, what do you think about that style of leadership? Does that improve the psychosocial position of people working for Ange, or does it make it worse in some way?
Well, look, I don't know. I was hoping that Michelle and Erika could enlighten me, because I just thought it was an interesting bit of feedback from today's game that the players have commented that at halftime the coach was really clear about saying, if you play this way and lose, I'm not going to hold you to account for that. That's my game plan. So provided we're following my game plan, I'm responsible for what happens. You just follow the game plan.
Okay, so Erika, let's get a psychologist view, and then we'll move to Michelle for a workplace view. What do you think, Erika?
Look, that is absolutely fascinating for me. There's two things. He's demonstrating really effective leadership. He is being clear. He's being clear on his role and the role of his direct reports. He's also being clear on, here is our game plan and here's your role in it. And he's also creating an environment of psychological safety. He's allowing them to fail. I think that's fascinating in the world of sport that's playing out, and he's doing a great job. I think it's awesome.
Thank you, Erika. Michelle?
Yeah. What he's done there is create an opportunity place for his team to feel safe, to have a go at something they're not very sure about, knowing that if they fail, that's not going to be held against them. And that's how you create psychological safety. And we know that in teams where psychological safety exists, you see improvements much faster than when it doesn't, because people will take a chance to see if something will work. And when it doesn't work, they will actually feel open to the learning that comes from that. So, it's a leadership style that I definitely resonate with, but I also know that it can be very effective. There's research after research and team cohesiveness studies that tell us when you can create a culture of safe to fail, you create an innovative and effective culture that actually has people get better outcomes at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Makes sense. So I'll close this one out by saying it has been a bumpy ride so far. The results have been mixed, but I think it's undeniable that under Ange Postecoglou, we've seen players outperform what they've done previously, and we've seen him have confidence in young players that previous managers maybe did not. So empowering his players, but making sure that he stands in front of that does seem to be a very effective approach.
And look, I mean, I'm not in the change rooms where they're discussing their game plan, obviously, but I'm envisaging, given his style, he's opened it up to say, here was the game plan, and then he's listening as to what they believe worked and what they believe didn't. So it's going to be an iterative process, but as Michelle said, they're going to get to the end goal and the end game as how he sees it a hell of a lot more quickly and more effectively than another leader would if they took a different approach.
Okay, from a strategic perspective, I'd just like to close it out by asking each of you a question. Steve, I'm going to start with you. So I want to expand the conversation a little. There have been other movements have happened over the last few years, really powerful movements, both from a business and a community perspective. The Me Too movement is probably one of the obvious ones, but I'm wondering, are we at the start of a new movement, or will this not be something that gets the same kind of momentum?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't have any special powers to tell the future, but I think it's a change that's here to stay. That we've seen a shift. The shift is that psychosocial issues are now something that are on people's radar, and I don't see that changing. And I think it'll become more and more a focus. I said at the start, I'm not trying to make a political point, but I think with Labor government's in, it'll be a priority for them, and we'll continue to see movement in this space. And in terms of expectations in the workplace, I think it's, well, certainly in the work that I do, it's clear that a big concern for people is feeling safe at work from a psychological perspective as well as a physical perspective. So I don't see this stopping. I don't see it slowing down. I see it continuing or increasing.
Thank you, Steve. Michelle, I'd love your thoughts on this. Is it a conversation happening in businesses that you work with? And where exactly does the conversation reside? Is it on the risk side of the business, the HR side of the business? Are they talking to each other?
Everyone's talking about this right now because everyone's wondering what is the obligation and how do we lean into this? This needs to be a cross-functional conversation. The worst thing we can do right now is make this a HR problem or a risk problem or a legal problem because there are so many elements to it. Yes, you can treat these risks the same way you would treat physical risks, but you also need to build capability. You need policies in place. You need senior leadership buy-in. So everyone needs to be at the table for this conversation, and it can't just be a functional problem, but a business problem to be solved. And every member of a leadership team needs to hold an accountability to actually making that change, because at the end of the day, it's a cultural change as well as a policy change and a capability change.
Excellent. Thank you. And we work with a range of different clients who are in different maturity levels from this perspective. And I think it's really important to say, if this is a conversation you're just starting to have, that's absolutely fine, but please have it. Erika, we've worked with some businesses, though, who have absolutely got this right. So what leadership traits or what traits do you see in leadership teams who are nailing this at the moment?
Yeah, look, just to build on, what Steve had said and also Michelle had said, where they're doing this effectively, they're engaging with the conversation. I get it's scary. If, on the surface, it is a bit scary. It feels a bit negative. But if you put that aside and again approach it with curiosity, that's the approach to take. And where it's being done well, it starts at the top, right? It's at the director level, and then they're engaging with their C-suite, and then that's filtering down. We do know, and this is published from, McKinsey, we do know that in terms of psychological safety, team climate is the most important driver here. And the way to actually establish a positive team climate is to do one of two things. It's first to actually support your team. So you need to support them, and what that looks like, it's consulting them, soliciting input and feedback. So it's that listening. And then it's demonstrating care and support for what they need as employees, but also as individuals. And then once you have the foundation, you can then help them learn and grow and stretch. So if we, for us to actually have that culture at the team level, that needs to be modeled and supported by directors, by the C-suite. And then you see this openness to this section of, okay, first we need to ensure that we listen and we support, and then we challenge. And then if we can role model from the top down, that will then build a culture of psychological safety.
Excellent.
Erika, I'd really love to add something to that as well. And, Jeremy, when you said if you're just starting this conversation, please have it. The other thing to keep in mind here is if you're just starting the conversation and you're not sure where to start, this is where networking is going to be so critical, because a lot of people are having this conversation and they too have been exactly, at that beginning point around where do we start. And the one thing that I highly recommend as a good place to start is have a look inward. Take some time to understand what is happening in your organization right now. If your engagement surveys don't have the questions in it that help you gauge culture and help you gauge how people are feeling or what the indicators for psych safety are looking like, you need to revisit those and look inward and assess. It's a really great place to start. And it doesn't need to be a full-blown survey. It can be as simple as a pulse or a check-in for people to just temperature check what's happening, so that then you can then lean into the how do we want to approach this? What are others doing, and what makes sense for our size business and our capability today as well?
And look, if I may, and Steve, please correct me if I'm going really off piste here, but for me, it's about get a baseline, understand where you're at, and then once you know where you're at, then work and iterate to mitigate any of the risks that you might see coming. No business is going to do their baseline and go, woohoo, we're great. There's always things bubbling under, but it's about we need to know where they're at so we can act. And if we're scared and want to bury it, we don't know where we're at. And that poses a risk in itself. So would you agree, Steve?
Oh, I'd agree entirely with that. I mean, I think the one of the big shifts is the idea that if you know nothing, you can't assume that everything's okay. So I think what we're seeing increasingly is whether it's regulators or legislative obligations saying, look, you have to make an effort to understand where are the risks in your organisation, and then having identified what they are, you've got to say, okay, what am I doing about it? And again, I don't think people are expecting, regulators and legislation aren't expecting immediate perfection, but they're expecting to see you trying to address the issue and responding in a logical way when you get information that, look, these are the issues in our workplace. You've got to be able to say as a director or a senior leader in the organisation, okay, well, this is what I did about it. I think that's one of the fundamental points here. It's an issue that has sat sort of under the rug for a long time, and I think people are increasingly saying, look, you've got to get on top of the issue.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's a great way for me to finish by reminding people what we all do and how we might be able to help. So I think Michelle gave some great advice there, though, in terms of leaning to your network. You don't have to necessarily speak to a professional. You can ask other people in the same industry or other HR professionals or legal professionals, depends on your role. Ask them what they're seeing and what they're doing. And that might give you some interesting things to do. But we at Insync love to work with our clients to help them measure and then improve. So we've got a range of different measurement tools, including a module on psychosocial safety, but also 360-degree surveys can be really interesting. Exit surveys can be really interesting. You can get some great data points there. And so we're looking to build up a set of benchmarks for psychosocial hazards in the workplace that will also help you understand how your peers are performing in this space. But don't leave that to chance. Michelle and the Growth Collective are experts at helping you develop your leaders, and especially your emerging leaders, where I think there's probably the greatest opportunity. And then if you do find yourself in trouble, or you think you might be, I would be giving Steve a call from Insight Workplace Solutions. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much to all of you for that great conversation. It's one that we're going to continue having, I know, not just with you guys, but with our broader network. So I'd love to hear from people. If we're not the right person to help you, we'll certainly help you find out who that would be. I hope we continue to take this issue really seriously. We all understand the strain that people have been under since the pandemic, the impact that's had on lots of people's mental health and well-being, and in turn, the strain that puts on our medical services. So to me, it's really, really important that we get this right, especially because it shouldn't be that hard.